welcome to the upstreamlife.com, and I'm your host and founder, Vishal Krishna. Old school philanthropy and traditional development approaches don't solve for impact because they don't really measure the outcome. Social finance has been around in many forms, and setting goals that can be outcome driven is really what makes all the difference. Many years ago, somebody asked me, what is development? It means different things for different people. So I want to find out what it means when it comes to educating children. And this podcast is going to occupy a large part of that impact that we're going to make with education for children. The word development, again, I'm reiterating, how do you measure it? If we had all the solutions to the world's problems, then we need not use that word, right? Think about it. So to answer what development means, it is necessary to spend time with someone who has been at it for 20 years. So I have with me Abha Thorat-Shah, the Executive Director of the British Asian Trust. She understands the need to measure impact at the grassroots level, and to go beyond this is the word that we all care about, is philanthropy. So she's going to talk about that. Philanthropy and development need to be connected and measured realistically. By the way, I want to talk a little about the British Asian Trust. The British Asian Trust ran the Quality Education Development Impact Bond, and the program ran from 2018 to 2022. So it exceeded targets by reaching 200,000 students. It says it impacted 200,000 students, ladies and gentlemen. Remember that number. BAT says that children learn 2.5 times more than those in non-participating schools, and almost all service providers have performed exceedingly well. By service providers, I mean the partners of BAT. So let's find out the impact that the BAT has made. Hi, Abha.
I'm very well, thank you. Good morning, Vishal.
Abha, so excited. Is it fair to ask whether development and philanthropy don't mean anything until you measure the outcome for beneficiaries?
So firstly, thank you for that question. A nice deep one to warm us up, Vishal. I would argue, yes, I think you are correct. If you are giving money away and you are not able to measure what the impact is, when the return is not, there isn't a social return, because here we are not looking for a financial return, I think your money is wasted. And the only way you can measure a social return is by measuring an outcome or an impact indicator. So I would absolutely argue that giving money away without looking for the outcomes or being clear on the outcomes you're planning to have, whatever they might be, is not a good way to do it.
I really want to know how one can measure impact, because that's how I started in the podcast introduction. I keep seeing so many family offices and corporations contributing to philanthropy. How do they measure impact? And how do they measure impact through the British Asian Trust?
It's a great question, Vishal. Most people start on the journey of giving, whether it's CSR, it's driven by legislation, whether it's family offices driven by the desire to make a difference, whether it's a corporate wanting to help the community they work in. They all start with the ability to do good, wanting to do good. The intentions are always very, very noble. And what they do is they look around their community. They say, okay, and let's take an individual, Vishal. You look at the people who come and work in your home. You think about their families. You think about how to make impact in their families, perhaps educate one of their children, pick up the fees for your driver's son. And I think those individual acts of charity continue to be something each human being in every part of our life do. Now, let's take that up a couple of levels and let's think about it as an institution. Now, that's when it becomes difficult and more interesting, and perhaps where you can really start becoming a little bit more professional, like you are in your mainstream asset managing. The way you manage your finances, you need to start thinking about, if I'm making difference with $100, what is it that I could be doing? You could be looking at an area of causes. You could be looking to see whether those causes, and let me use an example, are you allowing someone to learn to fish? Or actually, are you going and buying them, something which you think, giving them some clothes or food and thinking that's going to be the end? Now, if you teach someone to fish, that person becomes a fisherman or a fisherwoman, and then she has livelihoods and she's there she's able to serve her children. If you educate someone's child, you're able to see that child is able to change their own lives. So immediately you're taking a cause up and you're saying, giving someone a handout, you're giving a hand up, is what we call. And when you give somebody a hand up, the question is, how far is that hand up going to, what kind of a hand up is it? And is it a hand up they really want or they don't want? Or is it the hand up that's going to have the life outcome that they're going to do? So for example, if you skill a woman and you don't look after the fact that she goes back to the community and her father doesn't allow her to go to work, that skill is a wasted skill. So as noble as the skilling intent is, or as noble as the education intent is, you haven't had the development outcome that you want to have. So if you really want to empower a woman, you've got to be working holistically in the school to making sure the girl goes through school and the family feels confident that she's able to go to work. Now, so that's where that journey of change comes. And professionally, as you start doing it, you're able to see the causality between one thing to the other, take away things that don't work. Many good organizations talk about things like best buys, where is development actually working? Things like nutrition, where children come to school to eat, their learning outcomes goes up. There's a study in Africa, Vishal, they were looking at learning outcomes. They were looking at many things. They changed pedagogy, they changed teacher training, but they found that it was the deworming tablet that got the children's learning outcomes up, because actually children were falling sick when they were coming to school, and that's why they were not learning. So here's the link to an outcome and what you do.
Abha, I want to talk about your work at the BAT. You've been there for 2 decades, and I want to know everything from the day you started. Go for it.
Absolutely, Vishal. Before I tell you about myself, let me tell you about the fact that I am a representative of the British Asian Trust. So, we've talked earlier about diaspora and migrant journeys. Many of us Indians have migrated all over the world. We retain our Indianness and we adopt our country of where we go and live, where we study, where our political and other ideas are challenged and perhaps influenced by the way we see the welfare state, or we see a focus on democracy in different ways. And we sort of connect and compare and contrast what we have had all our lives, the vibrancy of our childhood, and perhaps where our children are growing up. The British Asian Trust is a trust of people like us, people, Indians and other South Asians who have left their country and have made another country their home. And it links us back to the subcontinent through the powerful medium of philanthropy and collaborations. So we and I are all representatives of that movement of wanting to do good with people in country, be part of the development story in India, be part of the real challenges, not just the good stuff, but also the not so good stuff, so we can be a partner to our country back home. For many of the British Asians who I speak to, who are our donors, who are our partners, many of them, Vishal, came as economic migrants. I still recall one of my early stories of a gentleman who now runs one of the largest taxi companies across South London. And he said to me, he would work in the night and his wife would work all day and they would see each other. And he was donating to us because he actually wanted to make sure every Indian had an opportunity for a hand up. Now, stories like that inspire us, motivate us. When I came to the trust, for a very, my migration story being an academic one, I think we talked about that. The desire to be able to connect the two countries that belonged to my identity was a really powerful one. And the ability to do it in my day job, how many of us are privileged enough to do something that connects something so deeply, as resonates so hard inside with what we do in our day job. The second thing I have to say is the British Asian community is hugely entrepreneurial. They have made, this country has, I think, 5% of this country is now South Asian of origin. Most of them have started their own businesses. We see them across sort of corporates. We see them as accountants, doctors, lawyers, and of course now a prime minister as well. Now that sort of mobility, social mobility within a couple of generations is a very, very quick social mobility that the South Asian community has seen here. Now, they desire that social mobility for every other Indian that they know as well. And they want to be able to show a way in which you can do that well. And that's what inspires me. And that's why I do my job. And I less about me, but more about where it comes from, Vishal.
Abha, so you've got to give me details of the bond, which is called the Quality Education India Development Impact Index Bond, right? And what does social finance mean to you? It's very important for me to find out, again, are you guys really impacting children and how?
Great. So when we started this trust and we were sort of motivated philanthropically, the one thing we started noticing is as we were doing funding, we were working with partners, running programs, that to measure impact was something you did later, Vishal. The impact report came after the program. The data from the impact report sat on a shelf and didn't have an influence in the way the program was run, or whether we actually learned whether one approach worked or not. We skilled a young woman. We said, yes, take. We skilled her. We didn't know whether the job had happened or not, or whether she stayed in the job, or whether that meant she had a life which was different from what we had done before. My own background is in finance, and I started wondering whether if you change the way finance is applied to development, can you change the way development happens? In development, the normal thing is go tell a social entrepreneur or a non-profit leader to change what they do on the ground. But could we, when we think about finance, do it differently? Could we make money go further? Could we make money be empowering in a way it isn't before? Could you change behavior incentives around the way money works? Those were the reasons that we were inspired. The reason to use data to make money work better, the reason to change behaviors, and then eventually the reason is to have impact. And social finance is about all of those three things. Hardcore evidence driving the use of money, not spending money when there is no evidence, using the data to have feedback loops that keep changing and more measuring and moving your program forward. So let's say, Vishal, you are running your organization and you find one kind of software is needed to do what you want, but your investor doesn't want you to invest in that. Your hands are tied. That's how nonprofits are run. They have to do one kind of program. If they want to change anything, they can't do anything. Even if you were that nonprofit leader, you would never be able to have the kind of impact you have. Social finance gives freedom in that finance and allows the nonprofit or the social enterprise to be in leadership of how they use the money, but they commit to the KPIs or the outcomes that they have to meet. And that becomes sacrosanct. And there is a data person sitting alongside them, giving them information. Here's your classroom. That's 30% in the top of your classroom. They're doing well. Here's your bottom 30%. They are struggling in maths or literacy. These are the challenges they're facing within the classroom. There could be a learning disability that you need to be dealing with. Your teacher needs support in the way she needs to be teaching. Your principal doesn't feel inspired because he's got to do all these government things. He's running, elections, or he's doing other health benefits, but he doesn't have time to be a good principal. Challenges of every day where they can move money around, make it work.
Let's get into some more details. Why are children, firstly, 2 years behind in India, especially in classrooms? And it's impactful, right? I mean, when you think about it, it is impacting a nation's intellectual capital when children are 2 years behind. I want to know how this bond helps these children.
India has done brilliantly well in getting children into school. Every child with the right to education was a kilometer away from a school. There was no need for any philanthropist anywhere or any corporate to build a school to make sure a child went to school. So that was not our problem. I think 90% sort of enrollment, a problem that other countries have issues with. Our country doesn't have an enrollment issue. So starting with the problem in education. Education, of course, being the sector, Vishal, that every philanthropist in India starts his journey. We're really interesting. In the UK, the top cause is animals. In our country, it's the top cause is education. Says something about us Indians. So we had to work with the top cause to start looking at change in the way finance works. That's one. Two, we had to start with the problem, and the problem was not building a school or setting up an institution for teacher training. The problem was, while our children were coming to school, our children were not learning. And learning, as Vishal, as both of us know, is an incremental journey. You set up your ABC and you set up your 1, 2, 3, and then it becomes, you have 2 apples and 2 oranges, and that's a 4, and that's a sort of conceptual piece of learning. And of course, we know about our sort of rote learning issues that we've all faced. I mean, while it's great to know your tables, what do those tables really mean, when you're doing your financial management when you grow up? Now, if basic learning doesn't happen in early grades, it becomes more and more difficult. Try teaching a class 10 child a scientific concept when they don't understand the language behind it, or algebra when you haven't had basic maths. So the really big challenge we started off with is catch the learning problem when you can have the biggest bang for your buck, which is your primary years. That's when our children were actually behind. And when you start going behind in the early years, 2 things happen. Either you drop out because your parent thinks, you're better off doing something else, terrible consequence, or you just keep going up. You have to children keep passing those grades. But by the time they get to the grades where it really matters, they're absolutely out of touch with what's happening in a classroom. So 2 terrible things. Even if you stay in the system, you're not benefiting. And if you really can't deal with it, or your family feels it's not worth it. The point is therefore to sort the problem at the root. So go back to the root causes. If you allow children to gain from the learning, they will stay in education. That's what the data shows. Don't get to the point where a problem becomes so complicated and so much more expensive to solve that you've already let years and years go. So let's go back to that problem. The learning crisis was what a lot of people were thinking about. The Dell Foundation, other partners, ourselves. We had seen Educate Girls do a really interesting single program impact bond and seen that actually when funding was applied differently, they were able to have incremental learning gains as well as allow girls to come back to school. That was our starting point. One Educate Girls, one brilliant success story. When we got together with a bunch of people who were interested in education in India, and we said, that's great. Can we do this at scale? Can we have lots of organizations part of this and enable them to show that kind of success? Wouldn't that be great? And allowing them to be able to teach children better, faster, quicker, and allowing them to innovate through this program. That's how our Education Impact Bond came about. A group of people came together around us, a group of outcome funders, a group of people willing to put in some investment. And that genesis was the genesis of this financial instrument, supporting leading nonprofit players in India. Those nonprofit players were allowed to do their work in a way that is very different here using data. And as a result, those same Indian organizations showed incremental learning gains for the children. So this was an $11 million project. The core partners, Vishal, are the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, the UBS Optimus Foundation, Comic Relief, Larry Ellison Foundation, the FCDO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Organization, and British Telecom. So these are our funders. The nonprofits we selected, and we looked at everyone in India at that stage, were our now market leaders. We're very proud of them. Kaivalya Education Foundation, the SARD, Dhyan Shala, Pratham Infotech, and Education Initiatives. They were our organizations implementing across India. And number of children, you asked, Vishal, we reached 200,000 children through this program. Yeah. Small in India, but huge for us because of the kinds of gains they showed. I would say 50-50 because government schools are where we work more or less. And unfortunately, it's interesting conversation. Most of the girls, a low-income family sends a girl to a government school. They may pay for a low-fee paying private school for their boys. So while I can't give you an exact data, I would say, yes, there would be a sort of, focus on girls within the government system.
Abha, I want to know, why did you choose children between the classes 4 to 8? Is there a reason why this particular segment made sense to create impact in education? The reason I ask is because I'd rather also understand how kids in the higher education segment can also be impacted.
At that stage, we had to be a bit pragmatic because we had to work where the best partners were working. So a degree of flexibility was there. Now with Nipun Bharat and others, and the way the progress has happened over the new education policy, we can be much more focused on certain classrooms. We found the best partners working in primary education and said, we gave them a degree of flexibility, 1 to 3, 4 to 8, depending on where they were working. So we didn't constrain them by setting a framework, which meant, I can't work with Kaivalya because they only work in this age group. If you were good in primary education, you showed promise, you were part of the structure, you were part of our program.
Abha, now let's talk about your implementation partners and the work that they've done, and also a little more about why not, help kids in the high school segment too.
It's a great question. At that point, this sort of data doesn't exist. Actually, even now, it doesn't exist in the way that sort of simple causality that you're talking about, finish school, finish primary, get into secondary. It doesn't exist. It exists in bits and pieces. We picked those organizations that showed promise. It's like investing in a bunch of entrepreneurs and seeing the ones who showed promise. The ones who said, yes, we will use data to change the way we do work. Yes, we do have systems that measure things. Yes, we have had one study that has shown that our children can learn. The ones who said, even if we don't have it, we're willing to be part of this. So that cultural intent and purpose and leadership was absolutely a critical part of choice. It wasn't that we had these beautiful, perfect organizations sitting there saying, here's our data, here's our causality, here's how we do it. It didn't exist. I mean, Vishal, people don't pay for that stuff. People pay, a philanthropist normally gives a nonprofit money to go run a program. By the time they get around to paying for data, it's something that they've kept a little bit of money aside to do it. Remember, it's a very underfunded area as well. So nonprofits absolutely strapped for cash don't have fancy data systems like Google or somebody else would. So we had to look for promise and aptitude over data and analysis. And the ones who showed us that, those were the guys who were part of it. We did another thing, Vishal. We talked to all the funders in India and said, who are the ones you really think are really promising in this education sector, who could benefit from this approach? And so we did a lot of cross analysis. Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, Vishal, had already worked with several organizations, and they were really open with their data. Something that I didn't realize, Vishal, when I was doing that work in the beginning was how much rich data sits within funders. Everybody who funds actually has so much more data than you would expect. It's like the way the government has all this data. It's really, really rich. And to mine it, it gives you information that you wouldn't have. So that was the first thing, promise. Not data, not information, not anything fancy. Each organization was doing something different. It's what we call, in the technical world, a theory of change. But let me simplify it. When you think about educating a child, let's assume it's your own child, you could sit down with them in the evening and do some work. You're working directly with the child. There are projects that do that. They directly sit with the child after school and do some homework or remedial. From my childhood days, the tuition classes, if you recall. There are other models in India that genuinely believe that that is great, but it costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time. India is a big country. The way to change it is to change the teacher or the educator. And there are models that really focus on that. How is the teacher learning? Who is the teacher? Is the teacher somebody who's always the most senior, most technical person, or can you have teachers who can be built in under the system? Gyan Shala, an organization that you know well, does that, really decodes teaching. Then there are others who believe, brilliant, the teachers are doing well, but if the school doesn't run very well, there's no inspiration, there's no leadership, we should be actually focusing on the leadership. It might take time for change to happen, but a great principal can transform a school. And you and I know that from our own school days, right? If the principal is inspired, motivated, encouraging, you have a school that's flourishing. Kaivalya, really looking at principal training model. Then there are others who believe you can do a lot of stuff with the money you have, but if you really focus on the bottom 20% children and look at their needs, the whole system changes. SARD looked at that. It also looked at train the trainers. Every organization is focused on education. The way they're reaching that child is very, very different. And this is the sort of brilliance of India. Our education sector, and I say this all the time, has some of the most creative people. Just yesterday, moving on from sort of primary education, life skills, I was talking to an entrepreneur, and he was telling me about his model of the happiness curriculum that he's taking into Delhi schools. And I thought, God, only in India are we always innovating, solving a problem, moving forward. So that's the sort of, you asked me about my partners. That's just a bit of a storytelling on how these partners think out of the box for the same problem, Vishal.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you a few numbers. There are 32 million kids who are not in school in Southeast Asia. This is a terrible number, and it is something that affects all nations. So I'm curious to know, what does it take for children to come back to school? India had midday meals, of course. So Abha, when you look at the Indian education system, it is so large. It has such large enrollments in class. Yet we have issues such as children being 2 years behind, even if they go to school. So how do you address these kind of issues?
Vishal, great question. And our government's all over this with the new education policy. The systemic issues, I wish I could give you the silver bullets, because in philanthropy, we look for them. They don't exist. The systemic issue, the word system is the entire car. It's not the engine. It's not the steering wheel. It's not the heated seat for the driver, definitely not. It's the whole machine working together. And that is that's the challenge, that's the opportunity. And I think we're all getting on to the fact that there's no silver bullet. There used to be a time that silver bullets were the answer. Do skilling, everybody's in a job. No, you do skilling and the skilling doesn't work for you, it doesn't work. Put children in school, that's the answer, not the answer. So let me decode the car for you, and the engine and the wheels and all of that. I think the focus on the policy, putting a really good education policy in place which focuses on learning outcomes is the beginning. The policy context sets the context. When you look at sanitation, it's when we started focusing on that. That's when things started changing. So that's one, starting with the policy. A really empowered education department able to spend the money on the right things. At the school level, what I learned from my work in the field is if the school is able to expend money and manage its budgets for its needs, not building playgrounds, because that's why the playground budget list is for the playgrounds. But actually, if they need to build a computer lab, they're able to do that. So allowing budgetary flexibility for money exists. Vishal, there's no lack of money, but allowing and empowering a principal to spend the money on what they need to early years, libraries, toilets, take what it might. Then, of course, is the sort of the technical end of learning, good pedagogy, the word that it's such a funny old word, but it's the word that actually means, are we using the most modern ways to teach our children? Are we still doing rote learning? Are we decoding the ways they learn? Are we understanding learning disability? There's so much learning disability. They're all on a spectrum, from sort of dyslexia, dyspraxia to all kinds of other things in the classroom. The science knows this now, Vishal. Science also knows that, for example, if you, I was listening to a couple of my partners who were saying, if you sing, a nursery rhyme, your brain is taking it in terms of learning that material. You're learning conceptual learning, focusing on conceptual learning. All these things, working with parents. My God, what we learned during the pandemic from our partners is parents became partners to school. They were picking up learning material, returning it, asking questions. We're talking about first generation learners, right? Not you and me who understand the material. I mean, I can't do my son's maths anymore, but he's much older now. But this is the kind of stuff, it is the car and not the bits. And if the sector as a whole is able to see that, and we have that sort of holistic understanding, I think the whole system improves, starting policy down.
Can you talk about the education bond returns, or the returns that it provides? Is it social returns or financial returns?
Firstly, it's not a bond, as you would call it. So I think the word development impact bonds, terribly misleading, terribly interesting sounding. But let me explain what it is very simply, and then we'll talk about the return. Usually the way funding works is you, Vishal, are the nonprofit partner. I give you money, you do the work. Whether or not you deliver the work or not, I still give you the money because I'm paying you upfront. Now, if I want you to deliver outcomes, I need someone to pay you to do the work. And I need to pay that person back when you've done the work or you've been validated to have done the work. As simple as that. That person who I pay is my investor. That investor is taking a risk on you, and I therefore need to give him a return on this. If he delivers the project with you, he gets his return. If he doesn't deliver the project with you, he doesn't get his return, or she doesn't get his return, her return. Now, the 8% return, it's up to 8%, not 10 in our case, 6 to 8%, has come about because the project has delivered its impact on the ground as measured by an independent evaluator. And that's the critical thing. Our children have been measured independently by an evaluator. So that is the impact bond. There is a service provider who delivers the service. There is an investor who gives you the upfront working capital to do the work. And there is an outcome funder, or a person who gives the money back to the investor when the outcome is being delivered. In many, many governments, in many, many countries, the government is an outcome funder. The government says, we will only spend money once we get the outcome. This could be, for example, for prison reform or for health outcomes. We have nurses striking across the UK today. And there was a time when this policy was used to say improve hospital numbers, the number of people waiting. So this approach of delivering outcomes using private sector to take the risk has been used in many, many parts of the world. While our government is not an outcome funder in this as yet, though they are looking at it very interestedly, that's where this can eventually go as one of the places of scale.
Ladies and gentlemen, I request you to check out the guidebook to cost effectiveness to understand how PAT's bond has delivered impact. Abha, so how is each stakeholder or partner incentivized?
Great question. So what we thought is, if you're giving the investor a return for what they're doing, let's also give the non-profit partners a return if they give us incremental learning gains over 4 years. Will that work? And they did get that return. We were delighted to give it to them. So there's an 8% return to the non-profits over and above their costs that the investors gave them if they overperformed, and we did give them that incentives. So while the program gives them unrestricted working capital to start their work in the beginning of the program, and Vishal, let me tell you, that is pretty rare. All of the way development finance works is based on, here are 50 children, have you educated those 50 children? Here's money for textbooks, here's money for computers. This money is about doing the work and getting the outcomes. It is to be used as efficiently as needed to be doing that. It sounds, for the private sector guys, they're like, yeah, of course, that's how corporates get, that's how private equity works. Or, we have a growth target and that's how we do it. But that's not how development finance works. That's the difference in this.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the guidebook, you will clearly see that the cost of keeping a child in school is less than or close to ₹1,000. So what is a cost-effective way of delivering education in our country? I'm curious, because if it's only ₹1,000, then we should be making better impact, right?
The government has such good budgets, Vishal. If you leverage government budgets, use the fact that there is infrastructure, adding a little bit more value as a philanthropist towards the learning outcomes, and it's a leverage. It's a leverage on government. That is people are surprised by that. You don't have to spend millions. Our government spends millions. We have on our children's provision of, going back to the state, the provision of that system. It's about aiding to that system and enabling it to do better. It's nothing more than that in India. India is good to its kids. It's about that value addition, quicker, faster, better. It's that bit. It's moving from perhaps our Maruti 800s to our Audis and our Teslas. It's that bit.
Why can't you increase the tenure of the bond? Abha, I just want to know, 4 years, don't you think it's too small a period to make impact? Please shed some thoughts on that.
It's a great question. I mean, there were two places we could go to. We could keep going like this, but they'd proven their model, the nonprofit partners. And the one thing is, do we need impact bonds, or do we need a change in the way philanthropy works? It could, doing impact bond after impact bond when a point has been proven is not necessary. In this case, the point had to be proven that if you fund it differently and you focus on learning outcomes and you give data, outcomes are there. Our partners now get that kind of money without us. Educate Girls went on not to do one more impact bond. They went on to do it for lots more girls. So it's a tool for change often, Vishal. It's not the tool, perhaps always, for growth. What we are doing is using that tool for different problems now, for skills, for secondary education, we're considering it, for FLN, sort of very early grade learning in alignment with the Nipun Bharat mission. Our route to scale is to say it's a problem-solving tool when misaligned incentives are there or finance is not doing what there is. Once it works, the system should work by itself. Simple grant making, if it follows the principles of doing what works and focusing on data and using evidence, it doesn't need convoluted impact bonds for that at this stage. Impact bonds are really, really critical when something's not working.
British Asian Trust has done some stellar work globally. You've helped in conservation, you've helped in flood relief. I want to hear more about your work globally and how can that come about in India?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that question, Vishal. The British Asian Trust works on those issues which start with the word prevention. We believe, again, going back to the hand up and not the handout, that any solution that allows a hand up or prevents a future problem from happening is the right way to work. Now, therefore, education, therefore, skilling, therefore, entrepreneurship, therefore, mental health, therefore, keeping children safe. All those things are part of our work. And the conservation, a newer area for our work, the interplay between climate and the issues that we work with, you cannot ignore that, Vishal. If you look at, our own country, the floods, some of the other the heat, one of the climatic challenges that are coming, the focus on employment as a result, what happens to our jobs when things change significantly, if water systems erode. These are all issues that we are interested in, and we are willing to work usually a little bit at scale because we like to bring people together, bring like-minded funders, diaspora members, family offices together to work with us collectively. Across those sectors, when there is an interesting challenge and we can offer an interesting solution with local partners and with governments, we are very, very keen to work with people. In gender, we are working on girl education. In life skills and life skills for girls, we are working, of course, as we talked, on primary education. We continue to think about ways to keep young children safe. It's a critical part of our work. I, I think for us, the cause is about making sure you're spending $1 early so that you're not spending a lot of money. Let me use mental health as an example. Vishal, pandemic brought that to bear, right? They say with mental health that if you have to wait for it to turn into a full-blown mental health crisis, billions of dollars are going to be spent. People are going to drop out of the workplace. Young people are going to have lives that they're not wanting to have. So the prevention on that is pretty much simpler. It's about enabling teachers to be early identifiers of issues. It's about enabling systems to work to prevent mental health problems. It's about sports. It's about healthy living. There's so many things you can do prevention-wise, which can make sure that you don't have a pandemic, so to speak, in mental health. So that's where our focus is. How do you catch it early, the problem, and make sure there are solutions which could be simpler, cheaper, more efficient, as against waiting for it to become a bigger problem. We started it last year, designed it during the pandemic in response to, of course, the migration crisis, in response to our women dropping off the workforce to care for families. And there, Vishal, it's one of my favorite projects. There it was to really talk about the big stat in India where women are dropping out of the labor force. In India, one of the only countries in the world that's happening. And we were wanting to understand why. Skilling, as you know, is always seen as a golden solution to all problems about putting people into the job force. But the government is skilling people. Why were they not getting into those jobs or staying in those jobs? That was a challenge. That's our impact bond challenge there. And that impact bond has just started and working with leading skilling providers and the National Skills Development Corporation to understand how do you skill a woman in a way that she stays in a job? What is it in the skilling provision or the work with the employer or the work with her family or the work with the community that will change her entire journey within her job, a job space? Is it that simple things like the job needs to be closer to her home or the job needs to be something that she can do work around? Those sorts of challenges are being dealt with in that program. Again, the kind of early data, I can't take it out as yet, is really, really exciting. And again, just like we did with education, the answers are not simple, but the solutions exist within our country and our own, provision, our own system itself.
So, Abha, what next for India? Can you tell us about what are the plans for BAT India?
You're catching us, at the fag end of the financial year, Vishal, when all of us sit down to plan. What next for us is how to make these kinds of financial tools simpler for all kinds of funders. Some people are afraid of them because they seem difficult, got data, got monitoring and evaluation. How can we scale them, make them more efficient, use them for the right problems, make sure people find it as easy to do as grant making or giving money away? That would be success for me, that anyone thinks, oh yeah, I can use an impact bond to solve this problem. But no, I can't use it here because it doesn't make sense. I'm better off doing it like that. Good work is when anybody can do it. When it seems sort of a little bit of an ivory tower and a bit convoluted and complex, that's when only fewer people do it. We want to demystify it. We want everyone to learn from what we are doing. And even if they're not doing every part of an impact bond, taking the best of what we do and mainstreaming it, our next journey is about bringing a lot more people alongside us to make it easier.
Again, viewers, I want to inform you that the bond is more about social impact. It's not your classical bond where there are yields and coupon rates. So how should they understand the bond, Abha? Once again, please, if you can.
No. The investors do get a financial return.
Tell me about that. Yes. That's interesting now. Go on.
So what they do, so let's say you're putting in £100 and what you will get back is £108, whatever. I'm really simplifying it. You do get a return on the capital that you put in because you put your working capital in without knowing whether it's going to work or not. Let's take skills. My investor, the National Skills Development Corporation and the Dell Foundation, have put cash into that skilling program. I'm going to pay them when that woman is in a job in 3 months. Now, and I'm going to pay them with a return at the end of the program. There is a return built into this depending on the project. The risk that you're taking on working with data, of doing it differently, of finding the solutions, has a return for investors. Financial return, not just social. Interestingly, social investors are not just driven by financial return, is what I'm noticing. When we mainstream it, yes, with ESG becoming much more mainstream, I think all kinds of investors are going to come into this. Essentially, doing good and making profit are now becoming one thing. If you look at where corporates are going, the big corporates, that is becoming the mantra, that you have to do good, the triple bottom line, all those sorts of things are coming to bear. So while the investment return is a carrot for people to come in, I don't think that's the real carrot. The real carrot is the sharp focus on results. People really love that. They love the fact that they can tangibly say X has happened, and they can't say it for another program. And it's really interesting, when people's money are at risk, they behave really differently, Vishal. They really sit in there and say, what's gone wrong? What's gone wrong? I don't see that elsewhere. So there's a behavioral change I see. And if that results bit is what investors find more exciting than return. I'm sure they can make better return in other places and quicker and faster and easier. But here they get that sort of satisfaction of having both, which I see a big change right now in the private sector. They are really interested in a way I've never seen. Almost a tsunami-like movement towards thinking about social return. Same time, there's, of course, impact washing. So things like this allow them to do it well and do it at scale, and still have that return attached to it. So it's more than just the financial return, Vishal, at least what I'm seeing today.
So, Abha, it's been such a wonderful session. I want to understand from you, what are your personal goals for 2023? What are you reading? Any advice that you want to leave us with?
I've been reading quite a lot about well-being this year, Vishal, because I have a growing team of very, very energetic, high-achieving young people. Well-being when I was working was about doing what the job is and working as hard as we can. Increasingly, I'm asked by my teams to consider their well-being as being a leader. How do you enable well-being while thinking of growth and solving tricky, deep social problems? That's been at the heart of what I want to do next year. I want a team that's happy, but I also want them to be perhaps driven in a way that is needed to solve problems that are not solvable right now. Hard one, Vishal. Think about it yourself. Work-life balance, family, competing priorities, inflation coming, a recession hitting. In all of that, how do you keep staff motivated, teams motivated, by making sure that they're looked after? Very hard one for all of us, who are in leaderships. And I'm sure you have the same with your team as well. Yesterday, there's a great program, Vishal, called The Moral Maze on the BBC. And they were talking about whether the value of work has changed over all these years. And they were saying a nurse striking, a caregiver striking, what does that even mean? These were jobs that were meant to be people who do good in their professions. Yes. And do we not think like that anymore? Are we all financially minded and motivated? I was really blown away. I thought, oh my God, that is true, right? You wouldn't expect a doctor to strike or a nurse to strike. But if they're not paid and they can't look after their family, God.
Abha, this has been such a wonderful interview. It's great to know the British Asian Trust and the impact that it's made. You have a wonderful new year, and I hope all of you enjoy this podcast. And if you want to ask me more questions, and ask me, and I will get them directed towards Abha, and she can answer all your questions about the British Asian Trust. Thank you so much, Abha.
Pleasure, and Happy New Year, Happy Christmas to you, Vishal. I hope you have a warmer one than we are having here.